In October of 1966, 2 months before his death, a man stood alone in a darkened room in Glendale, California. The room belonged to WED Enterprises, the research and development arm of an empire built on dreams. But the man was not dreaming now. He was adjusting. Before him stretched a massive-scale model of a city that did not yet exist. Miniature buildings rose from a plaster landscape, their tiny windows catching the dim light. Monorail tracks curved in perfect arcs above streets designed for pedestrians, not automobiles. At the center stood a climate-controlled dome, beneath which 20,000 people would one day live in perpetual comfort, perpetual order, perpetual happiness. The man reached down and moved one small structure a millimeter to the left. His hand trembled, not from age, he was only 65, not from illness, he did not yet know about the cancer multiplying in his lungs. The tremor came from something deeper, a need so profound it had shaped his entire existence. His name was Walt Disney, and he was building, as he had always built, a world he could finally command. The model before him represented his most ambitious vision, Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, not a theme park, a real city, a place where technology would solve every problem, where design would eliminate every ugliness, where careful planning would prevent every failure. In this city there would be no slums, no decay, no chaos, no fathers who lost everything and dragged their families down with them. Walt adjusted another building, then another. The tiny structures submitted to his touch, obedient in ways that people never were. He did not know that in 8 weeks he would be dead. He did not know that this city would never be built as he imagined it. He did not know that decades after his passing, people would still argue about who he really was, visionary or tyrant, genius or fraud, the man who gave the world its happiest place or a wounded soul who never found peace himself. What drives a man to build perfect miniature worlds? What wound demands such elaborate healing? To understand the city Walt Disney was building in 1966, we must return to the town he lost in 1910. We must go back to a place called Marceline. The happiest years of Walt Disney's life lasted exactly 4 years. They began in 1906, when his father loaded the family onto a train bound for Missouri, and they ended in 1910, when that same father sold everything and moved them away forever. Walt was nearly 5 years old when he first saw Marceline, turning 5 that December. The town sat in the rolling farmland of northern Missouri, a small community of fewer than 5,000 souls, built around the tracks of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. Trains passed through regularly, their whistles echoing across the prairie, carrying passengers and freight to distant cities that existed, for young Walt, only in imagination. The Disney family settled on a 48-acre farm just outside town. There were apple orchards and plum trees, pigs and chickens, a barn that smelled of hay and honest labor. The farmhouse was white clapboard, modest but solid, with a porch where a boy could sit and watch the clouds drift across an endless Midwestern sky. For Walt, it was the only true home he would ever know. He later called Marceline the most important part of my life. Decades afterward, when he built Main Street, USA at the heart of Disneyland, he modeled it on Marceline's Main Street, the same small-town storefronts, the same turn-of-the-century charm, the same feeling of safety and belonging that he had known for 4 brief years and spent the rest of his life trying to recapture. In Marceline, young Walt discovered drawing. He had no proper paper, so he used what he could find. One day, he took a piece of coal and drew pictures on the white wall of the farmhouse. The black lines stood stark against the painted wood, a horse, a barn, shapes that almost looked like something. His aunt discovered the artwork and, rather than scolding him, reached into her purse and paid him a nickel for his efforts. It was his first commission. He kept that nickel for years. His father, Elias Disney, was a different man in Marceline. The farm seemed to calm something in him. He taught his sons about the land, about the rhythms of planting and harvest, about the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. There were moments, rare, precious moments, when Elias would walk with young Walt through the apple orchards, explaining how the trees grew, how patience and care could coax sweetness from the soil. "You see this?" Elias said once, holding an apple in his calloused palm. "This took years. You plant the seed, you tend it, you wait, and then one day it gives you something back." Walt never forgot those words. He never forgot the feeling of his father's hand on his shoulder, the smell of apple blossoms in spring, the sense that the world was good and that good things lasted. But Elias Disney was not a man built for lasting happiness. He was a carpenter by trade, a farmer by circumstance, and a failure by fate. Before Marceline, he had tried and abandoned half a dozen ventures. After Marceline, he would try and abandon half a dozen more. Something in him could not rest, could not accept, could not be satisfied. And something in him, something darker, could not tolerate imperfection in others, especially in his sons. The discipline in the Disney household was strict, even by the standards of the era. Elias believed in hard work, moral rectitude, and the rod. When his sons disappointed him, and they often did, for his standards were impossible, he reached for his belt or his switch. Many fathers disciplined their children physically in those days, but there was something in Elias's punishments that went beyond correction. There was rage in it. There was shame. Elias was a man who had never achieved his own dreams, and he could not bear to see that failure reflected in his children's eyes. So he tried to beat the disappointment out of them. He beat his oldest sons, Herbert and Raymond, until they could take no more. One autumn night, when Walt was still young, both brothers fled the farm. They ran away in darkness, escaping their father's house, and they did not come back. Walt watched them go from his bedroom window. He was too young to follow, too small to run. But he understood something that night, understood it in his bones. Fathers could not be trusted. Security was an illusion. The people you loved could disappear, and there was nothing you could do to stop them. He also understood something about his father. Elias was not a monster. He was a broken man. His harshness came from shame, from the accumulated weight of every failed venture, every lost opportunity, every dream that had crumbled in his hands. He could not give his sons tenderness because he had none left for himself. This knowledge did not make the fear go away, but it planted a seed of something else, something like pity, something like contempt. Walt would spend his life caught between these poles, fearing authority and craving it, resenting those who held power and becoming one who wielded it. But that transformation lay decades in the future. In Marceline, in those 4 golden years, Walt was still a child who believed in apple orchards and train whistles and the permanence of home. Then in 1910, the golden years ended. On auction day, strangers carried away pieces of Walt's childhood. He spent the rest of his life trying to buy them back. Elias Disney's health had failed. Typhoid fever weakened him, and the farm, never truly prosperous, could no longer sustain the family. The decision was made. They would sell everything and move to Kansas City, where Elias had purchased a newspaper delivery route. The auction took place on a cold Missouri morning. Walt, 8 years old, stood beside his mother and watched as neighbors and strangers bid on the furniture, the farm equipment, the animals he had named and fed and loved. A man paid $3 for Walt's favorite pig. A woman took the rocking chair where his mother had held him as an infant. The apple trees remained, of course. You cannot auction trees. But everything else went to the highest bidder, piece by piece, until the farm was just an empty house and 48 acres of memory. At the train station, Walt pressed his face to the window as Marceline disappeared behind him. The white farmhouse grew smaller. The orchards vanished into the distance. The train whistle, once a sound of wonder and possibility, now seemed to mock him, carrying him away from everything he had known. He made a vow that day, though he could not have articulated it in words. Someday he would build his own Marceline. He would create a place so perfect, so complete, so entirely his own that no one could ever take it away. No auction could claim it. No father could sell it. No train could carry him from it against his will. It was the vow of a wounded child. It would become the mission of a man. The family settled into a modest house in Kansas City, and within months, Walt's childhood of freedom became a childhood of labor. Kansas City was not Marceline. There were no orchards here, no open fields, no trains passing through like promises of adventure. There was only work. Elias had purchased a newspaper delivery route for the Kansas City Star, and he expected his sons to earn their keep. Walt was 9 years old when he began delivering newspapers. He woke at 3:30 each morning, summer and winter, to fold papers and carry them through the dark streets. In summer, the work was merely exhausting. In winter, it was brutal. Kansas City winters brought ice and snow, temperatures that numbed fingers and froze breath, mornings so cold that the newspaper ink stuck to Walt's hands like black frost. One January morning, when Walt was 10, he collapsed in a snowdrift 3 blocks from home. His fingers were too numb to feel the newspapers scattering around him in the wind. His legs simply stopped working. A neighbor found him 20 minutes later, curled in the snow, shivering and barely conscious. The man carried Walt home and set him by the fire. His father's only response was to ask whether the papers had been delivered. Walt delivered papers for 6 years. His father kept the money. Elias saw nothing wrong with this arrangement. The route was his investment. The labor was his son's contribution. He fed them, housed them, clothed them. What more did they need? The concept of paying children for their work, of allowing them to keep what they earned, did not occur to him, or if it did, he dismissed it. Money was too precious to waste on boys who would only spend it foolishly. Walt learned to hide things from his father. He took odd jobs on the side, selling newspapers on trains, working as a candy vendor, and kept the earnings secret. It was his first experience with the power of ownership, the freedom that came from having something that was truly his own. But the newspaper route left its mark. Years later, Walt would wake before dawn, unable to shake the habit of those early mornings. He would dream of snow and ice, of stumbling through dark streets with a bag of papers cutting into his shoulder. And he would remember the feeling of working endlessly for someone else's benefit, of having his labor taken without acknowledgement or reward. There was, however, one person in Walt's childhood who offered something different. Flora, called Disney his mother, was a former schoolteacher with gentle hands and a quiet faith in her youngest son's talents. When Walt drew pictures, Flora praised them. When he told stories, she listened. When Elias dismissed the boy's artistic inclinations as impractical nonsense, Flora quietly encouraged him to keep drawing, keep imagining, keep believing that his talents might someday amount to something. She was not a demonstrative woman. The era did not encourage maternal effusiveness, and Flora had learned to navigate her husband's moods with careful diplomacy. But in small ways, a word of encouragement here, a saved drawing there, she let Walt know that she saw him, that she believed in him, that his dreams were not foolish, even if his father thought they were. "You have a gift," she told him once, holding one of his sketches up to the light. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Walt would carry his mother's faith with him for the rest of his life. He would also carry the guilt of what that faith eventually cost her. But that tragedy lay nearly 3 decades in the future, waiting in a house he would buy with money earned from a princess and 7 small men. For now, in Kansas City, Walt was simply a boy with a paper route and a secret ambition. He was waiting for his chance to escape. That chance would come through failure. Before Mickey Mouse, there was a bankrupt studio, a can of cold beans, and a young man sleeping on the floor of his own failed business. Walt Disney's first attempt at building something of his own came in 1920, when he was 19 years old. He had returned to Kansas City after a brief stint driving ambulances for the Red Cross in France. The Great War had ended before he saw combat, but the experience had given him a taste of independence, of life beyond his father's reach. Back in Kansas City, he found work at a commercial art studio, where he met a young artist named Ub Iwerks. Ub was everything Walt was not, quiet where Walt was gregarious, technically brilliant where Walt was merely competent, content to work in the background while others took the spotlight. The two young men recognized something in each other. They became partners, then friends, then something closer to brothers than Walt had ever been with his actual siblings. Together, they started a company called Laugh-O-Gram Studio. The concept was simple. They would produce short animated films and sell them to local theaters. Walt handled the business side, pitching to clients, negotiating deals, dreaming up new projects. Ub handled the animation, bringing Walt's ideas to life with a skill that Walt himself could never match. Here was a truth that Walt would spend his career obscuring. He was not a great artist. He had been fired from a job as a cartoonist in 1922 because his drawing skills were not strong enough. His talent lay elsewhere, in vision, in storytelling, in the ability to inspire others to create what he could imagine but not execute. Ub Iwerks could draw circles around Walt Disney, but Ub Iwerks could not sell a dream the way Walt could. For 2 years, Laugh-O-Gram Studio struggled along. They produced fairy tale adaptations, educational films, anything that might bring in money. But the money never came fast enough. Clients paid late or not at all. Expenses mounted. By 1923, the studio was bankrupt. Walt found himself alone in the empty office, surrounded by equipment he could no longer afford to operate. He had no money for rent, no money for food, barely enough money to survive. He slept on cushions from the office couch. He ate cold beans from cans. He bathed at the nearby Union Station, sneaking into the restrooms to wash himself with paper towels and sink water. It was the lowest point of his life. He was 21 years old, and he had failed completely. But something in Walt Disney did not know how to stay down. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was the memory of his father's failures and the determination to prove that he was different, that he could succeed where Elias had always fallen short. In July of 1923, Walt scraped together $40, some borrowed, some saved from odd jobs, and bought a one-way train ticket to Los Angeles. He packed a single cardboard suitcase with his few possessions and one precious item, a reel of film from an unfinished project called Alice's Wonderland, which combined live action with animation. He was going to Hollywood. He was going to start over. He was going to build something that no one could take away. He arrived in Los Angeles with a cardboard suitcase, $40, and the certainty that he had nothing left to lose. Los Angeles in 1923 was a city of dreams and dreamers. The film industry was booming, drawing ambitious young people from across the country, all of them convinced that they would be the ones to make it, to break through, to see their names in lights. Walt moved in with his Uncle Robert, sleeping in the garage of his uncle's modest house. It was not much better than the floor of the bankrupt studio, but at least it was California. At least it was a fresh start. His older brother Roy was already in Los Angeles, recovering from tuberculosis at a veterans hospital. Roy was the practical Disney brother, cautious where Walt was reckless, conservative where Walt was extravagant, focused on balance sheets while Walt focused on horizons. When Walt came to him with his plan to start a new animation studio, Roy was skeptical. "You just went bankrupt," Roy pointed out. "What makes you think this time will be different?" "Because this time I'm in Hollywood," Walt replied, "and because I don't have any other choice." Roy sighed. He had been sighing at his younger brother's schemes for years, but he also believed in Walt in a way that perhaps only an older brother can believe in a younger one, with exasperation and affection in equal measure. He agreed to help. He would handle the money. Walt would handle the dreams. It was a partnership that would last for the rest of their lives, and it would make both of them rich beyond imagination. But it would also create tensions that never fully resolved, resentments that simmered beneath the surface of brotherly love. Roy would spend decades making Walt's visions financially possible, and he would rarely receive credit for it. Walt would spend decades chafing against Roy's fiscal caution, seeing it as a lack of faith rather than a necessary break on his own excesses. For now, though, they were just two brothers in a garage, trying to build something from nothing. By 1927, the Disney Brothers studio had achieved modest success. They had produced a series of Alice comedies, and they had created a new character, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald was popular. Theaters wanted more Oswald cartoons. Walt traveled to New York to negotiate a better deal with his distributor, a man named Charles Mintz. The meeting did not go as planned. Universal Pictures taught Walt Disney the most important lesson of his career: never let anyone own your creations. Mintz sat behind his desk, calm and businesslike, and delivered the news. He was cutting the budget for Oswald cartoons, not increasing it. Furthermore, if Walt did not accept the new terms, Mintz would simply take Oswald and have someone else produce the films. He could do this because, as Walt now discovered, the contract gave Mintz ownership of the character. Walt had created Oswald, but Walt did not own him. There was more. Mintz had already approached most of Walt's animators and offered them jobs. If Walt walked away from the deal, he would lose not only his character but most of his staff. Walt sat in silence for a long moment, then he stood up. "You can have the rabbit," he said, "but you'll never have another character of mine." He walked out of the office and did not look back. The train ride back to California was long and bitter. Walt had lost everything, again. His character, his staff, his momentum. He was back to nothing, back to the empty feeling he had known in Kansas City, back to the cold beans and the borrowed money and the desperate need to start over. But somewhere on that train, according to legend, an idea began to form. If he could not have a rabbit, he would create something else, something new, something that would belong to him completely, that no distributor could ever take away. By the time the train reached Los Angeles, Walt had the concept for a mouse. Mickey Mouse was not born from inspiration. He was born from revenge. The mouse that would become the most famous cartoon character in history was not entirely Walt's creation. Ub Iwerks, who had followed Walt from Kansas City to Hollywood, designed Mickey's look: the round ears, the button nose, the simple lines that made him easy to animate. Walt contributed the personality, the voice, the spark of mischief that made Mickey more than just a drawing. In fact, Walt voiced Mickey himself. For nearly 20 years, from 1928 until 1947, every squeak and laugh that came from Mickey Mouse came from Walt Disney's own throat. It was an intimate connection, a piece of himself embedded in his most famous creation. The first Mickey cartoon, Plain Crazy, generated little interest. The second, The Gallopin' Gaucho, fared no better, but the third cartoon changed everything. Steamboat Willie premiered on November 18, 1928, at the Colony Theater in New York City. It was not the first sound cartoon. That distinction belonged to others, but it was the first to fully synchronize animation with sound throughout the entire film. Mickey whistled. He danced. He made music from the bodies of farm animals in ways that would horrify modern audiences but delighted viewers in 1928. The audience went wild. They had never seen anything like it. The combination of visual comedy and synchronized sound created something new, something magical, something that felt like the future arriving all at once. Walt Disney was 27 years old. He had failed twice, lost everything twice, started over twice. Now, finally, he had something that could not be taken from him. Mickey Mouse belonged to Walt Disney, and Walt Disney would never let him go. He had lost Marceline, he had lost Laugh-O-Gram, he had lost Oswald, but Mickey was his, and Mickey would change everything. Success, when it finally came, brought more than money and fame. It brought the possibility of a life beyond work, though Walt would always struggle to grasp that possibility fully. It brought him a chance at family, at connection, at the ordinary human happiness that had eluded him since childhood. It brought him Lillian. Lillian Bounds arrived in California in 1923, the same year Walt Disney stepped off a train with $40 and a cardboard suitcase. She came from Lewiston, Idaho, a small town nestled in a valley where the Snake and Clearwater rivers meet. She was 24 years old, unmarried and restless. The West Coast promised something her hometown could not: possibility. She found work at the Disney Brothers studio in 1924, hired to paint cells in the ink and paint department. It was tedious work, filling in the outlines that animators had drawn, applying color to thousands of individual frames. Almost all the ink and paint workers were women. The animation industry of the 1920s had clear divisions. Men drew, women colored. It was simply how things were done. Lillian accepted these divisions without complaint. She was practical, conservative, raised in a religious household that valued modesty and hard work. She did her job well and kept her head down. She did not expect to catch the attention of the young man who ran the studio. But Walt noticed her. Perhaps it was her quiet competence. Perhaps it was her dark hair and serious eyes. Perhaps it was simply proximity. The studio was small and everyone knew everyone. Whatever the reason, Walt began finding excuses to visit the ink and paint department. He lingered near Lillian's desk. He made awkward conversation about the weather, about the work, about nothing in particular. Their courtship was not romantic in any conventional sense. Walt was consumed by his work, distracted even when he was present, his mind always racing ahead to the next project, the next problem, the next opportunity. He did not bring flowers or write poetry. He did not sweep Lillian off her feet. The proposal, when it came, was characteristic of their entire relationship. They were driving somewhere. Lillian could never quite remember where, and Walt suddenly asked if she would marry him. He did not stop the car. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the road as if the question were no more significant than asking her to pass the salt. "Well," he said, when she did not answer immediately. "Yes," Lillian replied. "Now please watch where you're going before you kill us both." They married on July 13, 1925, in a small ceremony in Lewiston. Lillian's family attended. Walt's did not. The distance was too great, the expense too high. It was a modest wedding for a modest couple, neither of whom could have imagined what their future held. From the beginning, Lillian understood her role. She was not Walt's partner in the creative sense. She did not draw, did not animate, did not contribute to the artistic vision that drove the studio. Her job was different. She managed Walt. She soothed his anxieties, absorbed his frustrations, created a home where he could retreat from the pressures of his work. She was the calm center around which his chaos revolved. It was not an equal partnership. Lillian subordinated her own identity to support her husband's ambitions. She rarely complained, at least not publicly. But there were moments, small rebellions that hinted at the woman beneath the dutiful wife. When Walt wanted to name his new mouse character Mortimer, Lillian objected. The name was too pompous, she said, too formal. She suggested Mickey instead. Walt listened. He often listened to Lillian, even when he listened to no one else. She had earned that privilege through years of quiet loyalty, through her willingness to put his needs before her own. It was not a modern marriage. It was not an equal marriage, but it endured for 41 years until death separated them. The early years of their marriage were shadowed by a private grief. Lillian wanted children. Walt, despite his consuming focus on work, wanted them too, but conception did not come easily. There may have been miscarriages. The historical record is unclear, and the Disney family has always been private about such matters. What is certain is that years passed without a child, and each passing year added weight to their disappointment. Then, on December 18, 1933, Lillian gave birth to a daughter. They named her Diane Marie Disney. She was healthy, beautiful, everything they had hoped for. Walt was 32 years old, and he was finally a father. But one child was not enough. Walt wanted a larger family, wanted the house full of children that he had never quite had himself. When Lillian did not conceive again, they made a decision. they would adopt. In 1936, Sharon Mee Disney joined the family. She was an infant, just weeks old, and Walt embraced her as fully as he had embraced Diane. There would be no distinction in his love, no favoritism between biological and adopted daughter. But there would be secrecy. Walt insisted that Sharon's adoption remain private. He did not want the press to know. He did not want the public to know. For years, Sharon herself did not know. She grew up believing she was Walt and Lillian's biological child, never questioning why she looked nothing like her sister, never suspecting the truth that her parents had carefully hidden. Why the secrecy? Walt never fully explained. Perhaps he feared that adoption carried a stigma, that it would somehow diminish Sharon in the eyes of others. Perhaps he worried about his public image, about the perfect family that the Disney brand was beginning to represent. Perhaps he simply could not bear imperfection, could not accept that his family had been built partly through biology and partly through choice. Whatever the reason, the secret eventually came out. Sharon learned the truth as a young adult, and the revelation wounded her. She had been lied to by the people she trusted most. The foundation of her identity had been built on a deception. She forgave her parents, eventually, but the relationship between Sharon and Walt was always more fraught than the relationship between Diane and Walt. There was a distance there, a guardedness that never fully dissolved. Walt Disney loved his daughters. This was never in doubt. He provided for them lavishly, gave them opportunities that most children could only dream of, created a life of comfort and privilege that his own childhood had utterly lacked. But love and presence are not the same thing. Walt was consumed by his work in ways that left little room for ordinary fatherhood. He did not play catch in the backyard. He did not help with homework. He did not sit at the dinner table and ask about their days. He was there, and then he was not there, his mind always elsewhere, always planning, always building. When he did engage with his daughters, it was often through elaborate productions. He built them a miniature railroad in the backyard, complete with a working steam engine. He constructed playhouses that were more like small buildings, professionally designed and expertly crafted. He gave them experiences that no other children had, private screenings, behind-the-scenes tours, the full magic of the Disney empire at their fingertips. Years later, Diane recalled a Christmas morning when she was 12. She had asked her father for a simple gift, a day at the beach, just the two of them. Walt gave her an elaborate dollhouse instead, professionally constructed, worth thousands of dollars. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every detail was perfect. She never got her day at the beach. He loved us, Diane said in an interview decades later, but he didn't always know how to show it in simple ways. Everything had to be a production. It was the observation of a daughter who had made peace with her father's nature, who had accepted that the man who gave joy to millions of children struggled to give ordinary joy to his own. Walt Disney could build kingdoms. He could not always build intimacy. And yet the family endured. Lillian remained at his side. Diane and Sharon grew into accomplished women. Whatever distances existed, whatever silences went unfilled, there was love beneath it all, imperfect, tangled, but real. The Disney family was not the fairy tale that the Disney brand suggested. But then, no family ever is. By the mid-1930s, Walt had conquered the short film. Mickey Mouse was a global phenomenon. The Silly Symphony series had won Academy Awards. The studio was profitable, respected, successful by any reasonable measure. But Walt was not interested in reasonable measures. He wanted more. He wanted to do something that had never been done before, create a full-length animated feature film. Hollywood called it Disney's folly. They said no one would sit through a feature-length cartoon. They were wrong. The idea seemed absurd to almost everyone who heard it. Animated shorts ran 7 or 8 minutes. A feature film would need to run 70 or 80 minutes, 10 times longer. Audiences would never sit still for that much animation. Their eyes would tire. Their attention would wander. The whole enterprise would collapse under its own ambition. Walt did not care what everyone thought. He had chosen his subject, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the fairy tale collected by the brothers Grimm. He would tell the story with unprecedented artistry, unprecedented emotion, unprecedented scale. He would prove that animation could be more than comic relief before the main feature. He would prove that cartoons could make audiences laugh and cry and feel. Production began in 1934. The original budget was $250,000, already enormous for an animated project. By the time the film was finished, the cost had ballooned to nearly $1.5 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for the era. Walt mortgaged his house to keep production going. Roy warned him constantly about the financial risks, about the possibility of bankruptcy, about the studio's precarious position. Walt listened to his brother's warnings and then ignored them. He could not stop. He would not stop. Snow White had become an obsession, a test of everything he believed about animation, about storytelling, about himself. He drove his animators relentlessly. He acted out scenes himself, performing every character, demonstrating exactly what he wanted. He demanded revision after revision, rejecting work that did not meet his standards, pushing his team to achieve things they had not known they could achieve. "I've seen Walt act out that scene 50 times, one animator recalled. And every time he found something new, some little detail that made it better. He never stopped looking for perfection." The premiere took place on December 21, 1937, at the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles. Hollywood royalty filled the seats: Clark Gable, Carole Lombard, Marlene Dietrich, Charlie Chaplin. They came expecting to see an interesting experiment. When the film ended, the audience sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then Clark Gable began to applaud. Carole Lombard wiped tears from her eyes. One by one, the most powerful people in Hollywood rose to their feet, acknowledging that they had witnessed something unprecedented. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs became the highest-grossing film of 1938. It earned $8 million during its initial release, an astronomical figure that validated every risk Walt had taken. Disney's folly had become Disney's triumph. Walt was 36 years old. He had proven that his vision was not madness. He had proven that animation could be art. He had proven that he was not his father, that he could dream big and succeed where Elias had always failed. But success, Walt would soon discover, carried its own dangers, and it would bring him not only triumph but also the deepest guilt of his life. In 1938, flush with the profits from Snow White, Walt purchased a house for his parents near the studio in Burbank. It was a generous gift, a son's attempt to provide for the mother and father who had raised him, even if that raising had been marked by poverty and harshness and the accumulated weight of Elias's failures. Flora and Elias moved into the new house. They were in their 70s now, slowing down, grateful for the comfort their youngest son had provided. Flora, especially, took pride in Walt's success. She had always believed in him, had always encouraged his drawing and his dreaming. Now that belief had been vindicated beyond anything she could have imagined. But something was wrong with the house. The furnace, newly installed, had a defect. It leaked carbon monoxide, odorless and invisible, into the rooms where Flora and Elias slept. On a morning in late 1938, a housekeeper arrived to find both of Walt's parents unconscious. Elias survived. Flora did not. She was 70 years old. She died in a house her son had bought for her, killed by a furnace that her son had paid to install. Walt was devastated. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. He had wanted to give his mother comfort, and instead he had given her death. Every good intention, every generous impulse had led to this. Flora Disney, cold and still, in a house that was supposed to be a gift. He rarely spoke about his mother's death publicly. It was too painful, too personal, too wrapped up in feelings he could not articulate. but those who knew him well understood that something had changed after 1938. A shadow had fallen across his success, a reminder that even the best intentions could lead to tragedy, that the people you loved could be taken from you no matter how hard you tried to protect them. When asked about his mother years later, Walt would change the subject. When pressed, he would say only, "Some things are too hard to talk about." His eyes would grow distant, and whoever was asking would know not to ask again. The woman who had believed in him when no one else did, who had held up his childhood drawings and told him he had a gift, she was gone, and Walt had paid for the instrument of her death. Some biographers have speculated that Flora's death deepened Walt's need for order, his obsession with creating perfect environments where nothing could go wrong. If he could not protect his mother in the real world, perhaps he could build worlds where such accidents were impossible, where every detail was managed, where death and decay and failure had no place. It is speculation, of course. The inner life of any person remains ultimately unknowable, but the timing is suggestive. In the years after Flora's death, Walt's ambitions grew larger and more encompassing. He built a new studio designed to his exact specifications. He planned theme parks where every element would be carefully orchestrated. He dreamed of cities where nothing would be left to chance. Perhaps he was simply a visionary pursuing his vision. Or perhaps he was a grieving son trying to build a world where mothers did not die from faulty furnaces, where love did not lead to loss, where the things you built did not turn against you. Even as he mourned his mother, Walt pressed forward with his most ambitious artistic project. Fantasia would combine animation with classical music, creating a new art form that transcended the boundaries of both. It would feature works by Bach, Beethoven, Stravinsky, conducted by Leopold Stokowski and performed by the Philadelphia Orchestra. It would be animation for adults, animation as high culture, animation that demanded to be taken seriously. The film premiered in November of 1940. Critics were impressed, audiences were confused. Fantasia was too long, too strange, too demanding for viewers who expected Mickey Mouse and dancing dwarfs. It lacked a conventional narrative. It required patience and attention that moviegoers were not prepared to give. The film lost money, significant money, and Walt was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The public did not want what he wanted to give them. He never stopped believing that Fantasia was his masterpiece. Decades later, he still spoke of it with pride and defensiveness, still insisted that audiences would eventually recognize its genius. He was right, in a way. Fantasia has been re-released multiple times and is now considered a classic. But in 1940, it was a failure, and that failure wounded Walt deeply. He learned a lesson from Fantasia, though it was not the lesson he wanted to learn. The public would accept innovation, but only to a point. They wanted entertainment, not education. They wanted escape, not challenge. If Walt wanted to pursue his artistic ambitions, he would have to do it quietly, smuggling his vision into projects that appeared more conventional. It was a compromise he never fully accepted. Part of him always resented the audience for not rising to meet him, for preferring simple pleasures to complex art. But he was also a businessman, and businessmen must give customers what they want. The tension between these impulses, the artist and the entertainer, the visionary and the showman, would define the rest of his career. When America went to war, so did Donald Duck. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 transformed the Disney studio overnight. The military needed training films, propaganda, educational materials. Walt offered his services, and the government accepted eagerly. For the next 4 years, the studio produced hundreds of films for the war effort. Soldiers learned about aircraft identification, weapons maintenance, and military procedures through Disney animations. Civilians watched cartoons encouraging them to pay their taxes and support the troops. Donald Duck appeared in uniform, fighting the Axis powers with characteristic fury. The most famous of these wartime productions was Der Führer's Face, released in 1943. The short film depicted Donald Duck trapped in a nightmare version of Nazi Germany, forced to work in a munitions factory while portraits of Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito glared down at him. He woke at the end to discover it was all a dream, embracing a miniature statue of liberty with tearful relief. The film won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short. More importantly, it demonstrated something that would become relevant in later controversies. Walt Disney was no friend of the Nazis. Whatever his political views, whatever associations he may have had with questionable organizations, he had spent the war years producing explicitly anti-fascist content. His studio had served the Allied cause with energy and commitment. But the war years were also financially devastating. The government paid less than commercial clients, and the studio's regular output was severely curtailed. By the time the war ended, Disney was deeply in debt, struggling to regain its footing in a changed entertainment landscape. And there was another problem, one that had been building for years, one that would explode in the spring of 1941 and change Walt Disney forever. After Snow White made millions, the animators who created it waited for their share. They waited in vain. The success of Snow White had created expectations. Walt had promised his employees that they would share in the profits, that their hard work would be rewarded with bonuses and raises, and a piece of the fortune they had helped create. Some rewards did come, but not as much as the animators had hoped, not as much as they felt they deserved. By 1940, discontent was spreading through the studio. The Screen Cartoonists Guild, a union representing animation workers, began organizing at Disney. They demanded higher wages, overtime pay, and formal recognition of their right to collective bargaining. Walt was bewildered by the organizing effort. He had built what he considered a model workplace, a beautiful campus in Burbank with restaurants, recreation facilities, and working conditions far superior to other studios. He paid his top animators well. He treated his employees, he believed, like family. But families have conflicts. Families have members who feel undervalued, overlooked, taken for granted. And the Disney family had begun to feel that their patriarch was not sharing the wealth fairly. The situation came to a head in May of 1941. Walt fired 17 employees, including Art Babbitt, one of his most talented animators. Babbitt had created the character of Goofy and had been a leader in the unionization effort. His firing was seen as retaliation, an attempt to crush the union by removing its most prominent supporters. On May 29th, the animators walked out. For 5 months, the men who drew Mickey Mouse stood outside the studio gates with signs calling their employer unfair. The strike was bitter, personal, and devastating to Walt. Picketers carried caricatures depicting him as a dictator, as a greedy capitalist, as an enemy of working people. They chanted slogans. They blocked the studio entrance. They made clear that the happy Disney family was a myth, that beneath the surface of the magical kingdom lay ordinary labor disputes, ordinary resentments, ordinary human conflict. Walt could not understand it. He had given these people everything: good jobs, pleasant surroundings, the opportunity to work on projects that mattered. How could they turn on him like this? How could they stand outside his studio and call him names? He took it personally because it was personal. These were not strangers demanding better conditions. These were men he had worked beside, men he had mentored, men he had considered friends. Their disloyalty, and he did see it as disloyalty, cut deeper than any business dispute could. One morning during the strike, Walt drove to the studio and found himself face to face with the picket line. The animators recognized him, of course. They shouted at him. They waved their signs. One of them, a man Walt had known for years, looked him directly in the eye. "You're a fraud, Disney," the man said. "Everything you built, we built, and you won't even pay us fairly for it." Walt said nothing. He drove through the gate and parked his car and sat for a long moment, alone, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. The strike ended in September of 1941, resolved through federal mediation. The union won recognition. Wages increased. Working conditions improved. By any objective measure, the animators had achieved their goals. But Walt never forgave them. The wound was too deep, the sense of broken trust too profound. He began to see conspiracies everywhere, to suspect that the strike had been orchestrated not by legitimate labor grievances, but by communist agitators seeking to destroy him. This was not entirely fantasy. The Communist Party was indeed active in Hollywood labor organizing during the 1930s and 40s. Some of the strike leaders did have leftist sympathies, but Walt's response went far beyond reasonable concern about political infiltration. He became obsessed with the idea that communists had targeted him specifically, that the strike was part of a larger plot to undermine American values. The strike ended in September. Walt's capacity for trust ended with it. 6 years after the strike, Walt Disney sat before Congress and named names. On October 24, 1947, Walt appeared as a friendly witness before the House Un-American Activities Committee. The committee was investigating communist influence in the motion picture industry, and Walt was eager to share what he knew, or what he believed he knew. He testified that the 1941 strike had been instigated by communist agitators. He named names: Herbert Sorrell, the labor leader who had organized the walkout, and others he suspected of communist sympathies. He described the strike as an attempt to take over his studio, to use Disney as a base for spreading communist propaganda. "I feel that they really ought to be smoked out and shown up for what they are," Walt told the committee, "so that all of the good, free causes in this country, all the liberalisms that really are American, can go out without the taint of communism." Herbert Sorrell, the union organizer Walt named, found himself blacklisted from the industry. He never worked in Hollywood again. Whether Walt knew or cared about this consequence, history does not record. His testimony was not the most damaging given during the Hollywood blacklist era. He did not single-handedly destroy careers the way some witnesses did, but he contributed to an atmosphere of suspicion and persecution that ruined lives and violated principles of free association that Americans claim to hold dear. Why did he do it? The question has no simple answer. Part of it was genuine belief. Walt was a conservative, a patriot, a man who loved his country and feared its enemies. He truly believed that communism posed a threat to American values, and he truly believed that the strike had been part of that threat. But part of it was also revenge. The men he named had hurt him. They had stood outside his studio and called him names. They had shattered his illusion of the Disney family. Now he had a chance to hurt them back, to use the power of the federal government to punish those who had wronged him. The testimony revealed something about Walt Disney that his public image carefully concealed. He could be vindictive. He could hold grudges. He could use his influence to harm people who had crossed him. The kindly uncle who entertained children was also a man capable of cold calculation, of settling scores, of wielding power without mercy. It was not his finest hour. Decades later, it remains one of the most troubling aspects of his legacy, a reminder that the creator of beloved entertainments was also a flawed human being, capable of actions that caused real harm to real people. The strike and its aftermath changed Walt Disney permanently. He became more guarded, more suspicious, more convinced that loyalty was the supreme virtue and disloyalty the supreme sin. He demanded absolute commitment from his employees and viewed any questioning of his authority as potential treachery. The man who had once worked alongside his animators, acting out scenes and sharing in the creative process, increasingly retreated into executive isolation. He was still involved in productions, still passionate about quality, still capable of brilliant creative insights. But something had hardened in him. The openness was gone. The trust was gone. He had built a kingdom, and he had learned that kingdoms require walls. In 1955, Walt Disney stood at the gates of his impossible dream, watching thousands of people stream into a place that existed only because he had willed it into being. Disneyland was open. The doubters had been proven wrong again. But outside those gates, other doubts persisted. Questions about who Walt Disney really was. Questions that would follow his legacy long after his death. Before we enter those gates, we must address those questions directly. They deserve honest answers. Was Walt Disney an anti-Semite? The accusation has followed his reputation for decades, repeated in articles and documentaries, accepted by many as established fact. The evidence cited is familiar. A cartoon wolf drawn with Jewish stereotypes, a meeting with a Nazi filmmaker, membership in an organization with unsavory associations. Taken together, these details seem to paint a damning portrait. But evidence must be examined carefully, and the full picture is more nuanced than the accusations suggest. The wolf in question appeared in Three Little Pigs, released in 1933. In one scene, the big bad wolf disguised himself as a Jewish peddler, complete with exaggerated features and a Yiddish accent. The stereotype was offensive, a product of casual prejudices that pervaded American entertainment in that era. When complaints arose, the studio redrew the scene, removing the most objectionable elements. Was this evidence of Walt's personal hatred, or simply the unthinking bias of an era when such stereotypes were commonplace in cartoons, vaudeville, and radio programs across America? The question is difficult to answer definitively. What is clear is that the studio responded to criticism by changing the offending material, not the response one would expect from a committed bigot who believed in what he had created. The meeting with Leni Riefenstahl is more troubling. In 1938, just weeks after Kristallnacht, the night of organized violence against Jews throughout Nazi Germany, Walt gave the German filmmaker a tour of his studio. Riefenstahl was Hitler's favorite director, the creator of propaganda films that glorified the Nazi regime. Her visit to Hollywood was controversial, and most studio heads refused to meet with her. Many of those studio heads were Jewish. They understood what was happening in Germany. They wanted no part of it. Walt did not refuse. He showed her around, posed for photographs, treated her as a professional colleague. The images from that visit have haunted his reputation ever since. Why did he do it? No definitive answer exists. Perhaps he was naive about the political implications. Many Americans in 1938 did not yet grasp the full horror of what the Nazi regime represented. Perhaps he separated art from politics in ways that seem impossible today. Riefenstahl was, whatever else she was, a technically brilliant filmmaker, and Walt admired technical brilliance. Perhaps he simply did not think carefully about what the meeting would signify. Whatever his reasoning, the visit was a serious lapse in judgment, one that provided ammunition for those who would later accuse him of Nazi sympathies. It was a mistake. Whether it was evidence of something darker remains unclear. The third piece of evidence is Walt's membership in the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization founded in 1944 to combat what its members saw as communist influence in Hollywood. The alliance included vocal anti-Semites among its membership, and its rhetoric sometimes veered into territory that echoed fascist talking points. But membership in an organization does not necessarily mean endorsement of every view held by every member. Walt joined the alliance primarily because of his anti-communist convictions, shaped by the 1941 strike that had wounded him so deeply. His participation reflected his political conservatism, not necessarily any racial or religious prejudice. Many people belonged to organizations whose other members held views they did not share. This was true in 1944, and it remains true today. Against these troubling details must be weighed substantial evidence to the contrary. Neil Gabler, the author of the most comprehensive Disney biography ever written, is himself Jewish. He was granted unprecedented access to the Disney archives, examining thousands of documents, letters, memos, and internal communications spanning decades. His conclusion, after years of exhaustive research, was unequivocal. He found no evidence of personal antisemitism on Walt's part. This was not a casual determination. Gabler was specifically looking for such evidence, aware of the accusations that had circulated for years. He examined Walt's private correspondence, his business dealings, his personal relationships. He found nothing to support the characterization of Walt Disney as an anti-Semite. The Jewish organization B'nai B'rith named Walt their Man of the Year in 1955. This was not an honor bestowed carelessly or without investigation. The organization vetted recipients carefully before granting such recognition, and they found nothing disqualifying in Walt's record. It is difficult to imagine that a prominent Jewish organization would honor a man they believed harbored hatred toward their community. Numerous Jewish employees worked at the Disney studio throughout Walt's tenure, many in positions of significant responsibility. Joe Grant, who was Jewish, served as head of the character model department and contributed to some of Disney's most beloved films, including Snow White and Dumbo. Harry Tittle, also Jewish, worked as a production manager for decades. These were not token positions. These were jobs that required direct collaboration with Walt, often on a daily basis. "I never experienced any discrimination from Walt," Grant said in an interview late in his life. "He judged people by their work, not by their background. If you could do the job, he didn't care where you came from or what you believed. I worked closely with him for years, and I never once heard him say anything anti-Semitic." Walt made documented donations to Jewish charities and causes throughout his career. He maintained friendships with Jewish colleagues and business partners. His actions, examined in totality, do not support the portrait of a committed anti-Semite. The truth lies somewhere in the middle ground that history rarely allows. Walt Disney was a man of his time, raised in an era when casual prejudices were common and rarely examined. He may have held stereotyped views about various groups, as many Americans of his generation did, but there is no credible evidence that he harbored the kind of ideological hatred that the term anti-Semitism properly describes. He was flawed. He made mistakes. He associated with people and organizations that history has rightly condemned, but the evidence does not support the characterization of Walt Disney as a dedicated bigot. Intellectual honesty requires acknowledging this complexity, even when simpler narratives might be more satisfying to those who prefer their villains uncomplicated. One film haunts Disney's legacy more than any other, and the company has never re-released it. Song of the South premiered in 1946, a blend of live action and animation set in the post-Civil War South. The film adapted the Uncle Remus stories collected by Joel Chandler Harris, featuring an elderly black storyteller who entertains a young white boy with tales of B'er Rabbit and his adventures. The animation sequences were brilliant, among the finest work the studio had ever produced. The B'er Rabbit segments demonstrated technical mastery and creative energy that rivaled anything Disney had made. The song, Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah, won the Academy Award for Best Original Song and became one of Disney's most enduring musical creations, still recognized and hummed by people who have never seen the film it came from. James Baskett, who played Uncle Remus, received an honorary Academy Award for his performance, the first black man to receive any Academy Award. His portrayal was warm, dignified, and deeply human. He brought genuine artistry to a role that could easily have been a mere stereotype. But the film was controversial from the moment of its release. Critics, particularly in the black press, condemned its romanticized portrayal of plantation life, its depiction of happy former slaves' content with their subordinate position, its erasure of the brutality and injustice that defined the actual post-war South. The NAACP organized protests. Picket lines formed outside theaters. The controversy was immediate and sustained. Walt seemed genuinely surprised by the backlash. He had intended the film as a celebration of African American folklore, a tribute to the storytelling traditions that Harris had collected. He did not understand, or did not want to understand, how the framing of those stories perpetuated harmful stereotypes, how the nostalgic glow of the plantation setting whitewashed a history of oppression. The problem was not the BR rabbit tales themselves. Those stories had genuine roots in African American culture, brought to America by enslaved people and passed down through generations. The problem was the frame, the happy plantation, the contented workers, the benevolent relationship between white landowners and their black neighbors. It was a fantasy that bore no relationship to historical reality, and it served to minimize the horrors of slavery and its aftermath. James Baskett, despite his acclaimed performance, could not attend the film's premiere in Atlanta. Segregation laws prohibited him from entering the theater where his own work was being celebrated. He stood outside while white audiences inside applauded his image on the screen. The irony was grotesque, and it illustrated exactly what critics meant when they said the film ignored the reality of race in America. Baskett died 2 years later, in 1948. He never received full recognition during his lifetime for a performance that had earned him Hollywood's highest honor. The controversy deepened over the decades. As American society grappled more honestly with its racial history, Song of the South became increasingly indefensible. The Disney company quietly withdrew the film from circulation. It has never been released on home video in the United States. It remains locked in the vault, a reminder of attitudes that the company no longer wishes to endorse. The irony is that the animated sequences, the BR Rabbit stories themselves, remain delightful, but they cannot be separated from the live-action frame that surrounds them. The film is a package, and the package is poison. Was Walt Disney personally racist? The question parallels the anti-Semitism debate, and the answer is similarly layered. He was a product of his era, raised with assumptions about race that most white Americans of his generation shared. His films reflected those assumptions, sometimes in ways that are painful to watch today. But there is little evidence of personal animosity toward Black Americans or any other racial group. He was not a crusader for civil rights, but neither was he an advocate for segregation. He occupied the uncomfortable middle ground of many white Americans of his time, not actively hostile, but not actively engaged, content to accept the racial hierarchies of his society without examining them too closely. It is not an admirable position, but it is a human one, and understanding Walt Disney requires acknowledging his humanity, including the limitations and blind spots that humanity entailed. The Disney brand meant trust. Families believed what Disney showed them. That trust, it would later emerge, was sometimes misplaced. In 1958, the Disney studio released White Wilderness, a nature documentary that won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. The film depicted wildlife in the Arctic regions of North America, capturing stunning footage of polar bears, caribou, wolves, and other creatures in their natural habitats. It was presented as an authentic look at nature, filmed by patient cameramen who had spent months in the frozen wilderness waiting for the perfect shot. One sequence became particularly famous, the lemming migration. The film showed hundreds of lemmings marching in great masses toward a cliff, then plunging over the edge into the sea below. The narration explained that this was natural behavior, that lemmings periodically engaged in mass suicide when their populations grew too large. It was dramatic, memorable, and seemingly educational. It was also completely false. Lemmings do not commit mass suicide. They do migrate in large numbers, and some do die during these migrations, drowning while attempting to cross bodies of water, for instance, or falling victim to predators. But the deliberate march to death depicted in White Wilderness was a fabrication, invented for dramatic effect. Investigations conducted years later revealed the disturbing truth. The filmmakers had purchased lemmings from Inuit children in Manitoba and transported them to Alberta, Canada, a location where lemmings do not naturally occur. They placed the animals on a snow-covered turntable to create the illusion of a massive migration, filming them from angles that made a few dozen lemmings look like hundreds. And when it came time to film the climactic plunge, they herded the lemmings off a cliff and into the water, where many drowned. The sequence was staged, the animals were killed, and the myth it created, that lemmings mindlessly follow each other to their deaths, persists to this day, repeated in countless articles, conversations, and even scientific discussions by people who learned it from a Disney documentary they watched as children. Walt himself may not have known the details of how the lemming footage was obtained. Documentary production involved many people working in remote locations, and the head of a major studio could not oversee every decision made in the field. But the film bore his name, carried his brand, represented his company's values to millions of viewers. The responsibility, ultimately, was his. It is a small scandal compared to the labor disputes and political controversies that marked his career. No human beings were harmed, but it reveals something troubling about the Disney approach to storytelling, the willingness to shape reality to fit a narrative, to sacrifice truth for dramatic impact, to create the appearance of nature while violating nature's actual workings. Families trusted Disney to show them the truth about the world. In this case, that trust was betrayed. The magic, it turned out, sometimes came at a cost. But that same drive to create perfect experiences, to shape reality according to his vision, would also produce Walt Disney's greatest achievement. Not a film, not a character, a place. Walt Disney looked at dirty, dangerous amusement parks and saw something no one else could. A clean, safe world where families could escape together. By the early 1950s, Walt had grown restless. The studio was successful, producing animated features and live-action films that audiences loved. But something was missing. Walt wanted to build something physical, something you could walk through and touch, something that existed in 3 dimensions rather than flickering on a screen. He began visiting amusement parks with his daughters, and what he saw disappointed him profoundly. The parks were shabby, poorly maintained, staffed by surly employees who seemed to resent the customers. The rides were thrilling, but the environments were ugly, garish colors, peeling paint, trash accumulating in corners. Parents sat on benches, bored and uncomfortable, while their children ran from attraction to attraction. The experience was fragmented, chaotic, without coherence or purpose. Walt imagined something different. He imagined a park where the entire family could enjoy themselves together, where every detail was carefully designed, where cleanliness and courtesy were paramount. He imagined a place that told stories, that transported visitors to other times and places, that created not just excitement but wonder. He called his vision Disneyland. Lillian thought he was losing his mind. Why would anyone pay to see a bunch of fake buildings? She asked when he first described his plans. Walt had an answer ready, because they'll be inside my dream. It was a revealing response. Disneyland was not merely a business venture or an entertainment project. It was Walt's inner world made manifest, his vision of how life should be, his answer to the chaos and disappointment of the real world. In Disneyland, Main Street would always be clean. The trains would always run on time. Fathers would not fail and families would not fracture, and the things you loved would not be taken away. It was Marceline, perfected and preserved forever. The project faced enormous obstacles. Banks refused to lend money for what seemed like a foolish gamble. Who would invest in an amusement park, especially one run by an animator with no experience in the field? Walt's own brother Roy was skeptical, warning about the financial risks, urging caution and restraint. The entertainment industry watched with a mixture of curiosity and schadenfreude, waiting for Disney's Folly, the sequel. Walt found financing through an unlikely source: television. He made a deal with ABC to produce a weekly television program in exchange for investment in the park. It was a gamble that paid off spectacularly. The television show promoted the park, and the park promoted the television show, creating a synergy that would become a model for entertainment companies for decades to come. Construction began in 1954 on 160 acres of orange groves in Anaheim, California. Walt visited the site constantly, obsessing over every detail. He walked the grounds imagining sight lines, calculating how visitors would move from one area to another, ensuring that nothing would break the spell he was trying to create. The park was divided into themed lands, each with its own identity: Main Street USA, Adventureland, Frontierland, Fantasyland, Tomorrowland. Visitors would enter through Main Street, a recreation of small-town America at the turn of the century, Marceline essentially frozen in amber. From there they could explore jungles and frontiers, fairy tales and futures, all within walking distance of each other. Every element was designed to support the illusion. Buildings on Main Street were constructed at reduced scale, full-sized at street level, but progressively smaller on the upper floors, making them feel intimate and welcoming rather than imposing. Trash cans were placed at precise intervals, based on Walt's observation of how far people would walk before discarding garbage. Underground tunnels allowed employees, cast members, in Disney terminology, to move between areas without being seen, ensuring that a cowboy from Frontierland would never be spotted walking through Tomorrowland. The attention to detail was extraordinary. It was also, in its way, obsessive. Walt was not merely building an amusement park. He was constructing a world where every variable was accounted for, where nothing was left to chance, where reality itself could be managed and perfected. Opening day was supposed to be a triumph. It became a disaster. Walt called it Black Sunday. It nearly destroyed everything. July 17, 1955, was meant to be the culmination of Walt's vision. Invitations had been sent to 11,000 guests for a private preview before the park opened to the public. Television cameras were ready to broadcast the event to millions of viewers across the country. Walt had rehearsed every element, planned every moment, prepared for every contingency. He had not prepared for counterfeit tickets. Someone had duplicated the invitations, and on opening day, 28,000 people showed up instead of 11,000. The park was overwhelmed. Lines stretched for hours. Tempers flared. The carefully orchestrated experience dissolved into chaos. And that was only the beginning. The temperature reached 101 degrees Fahrenheit. The asphalt on Main Street, freshly laid and not yet fully cured, began to soften in the brutal heat. Women's high heels sank into the pavement, trapping them in place. One woman, wearing her finest shoes for what she thought would be a glamorous occasion, found herself literally stuck in the softening tar. She struggled to pull free, then finally stepped out of her shoes entirely, walking the rest of Main Street in her stockings, while her expensive pumps slowly disappeared into the black surface behind her. A gas leak forced the closure of Fantasyland, one of the park's main attractions. Rides broke down throughout the day. The boats in the Jungle Cruise stalled. The cars on the Autopia ran out of gas. The riverboat nearly capsized from overcrowding. Drinking fountains failed to work. A plumber's strike had delayed their installation, and Walt had been forced to choose between working fountains and working toilets. He chose toilets, which meant that on the hottest day of the summer, there was nothing to drink. Vendors ran out of food by noon. The Mark Twain riverboat, designed to carry 100 passengers, was packed with 300, listing dangerously as frightened guests clutched the railings. At one point, there were legitimate fears that the boat would capsize. The live television broadcast captured much of the chaos. 90 million Americans watched as the dream stumbled and faltered, as the perfect world Walt had envisioned revealed itself to be all too imperfect. Technical difficulties plagued the broadcast. Cameras failed at crucial moments. Commentators struggled to fill dead air while crews scrambled to fix problems. Walt was devastated but not defeated. He walked the park throughout that terrible day, observing problems, taking notes, already planning solutions. When subordinates panicked, he remained calm. When reporters asked about the disasters, He acknowledged them without making excuses. "We'll fix it," he said. "We always fix it." And they did. Within weeks the problems were resolved. The asphalt hardened. The rides were repaired. The gas leak was sealed. The drinking fountains were installed. Disneyland began operating as Walt had envisioned, and visitors came by the millions. By the end of its first year, the park had welcomed nearly 4 million guests. By the end of its first decade, that number had grown to 50 million. Disneyland became a cultural phenomenon, a pilgrimage site for families across America and around the world. It proved that Walt's vision was not madness, that people would indeed pay to walk through his dream. But the dream came with rules. Disneyland was not just a park, it was a philosophy, happiness through absolute order. Walt established strict guidelines for every aspect of the operation. No alcohol was served anywhere in the park, a policy that remained in place for decades after his death. No chewing gum was sold, to prevent the unsightly mess of discarded gum on walkways. Employees were required to adhere to rigid grooming standards. No beards, no long hair, no visible tattoos. The rules extended to behavior as well as appearance. Cast members were trained to never point with a single finger, considered rude in some cultures, but always with 2 fingers or an open palm. They were forbidden from saying, "I don't know," to any guest question. Instead, they were to find someone who did know or escort the guest to the information they needed. They were expected to maintain cheerful demeanors at all times, regardless of how they actually felt. Walt himself patrolled the park regularly, sometimes in disguise, looking for problems. He picked up trash when he saw it, and expected others to do the same. He noted when paint was chipped or flowers were wilting. He fired employees on the spot for violations of his standards, a practice that terrified his staff but ensured that his vision was maintained with absolute fidelity. The underground tunnels, called utilidors, became symbols of the Disney approach. Beneath the Magic Kingdom lay a network of passages where the real work of the park took place: deliveries, trash removal, employee movement, maintenance operations. Guests never saw this infrastructure. They experienced only the polished surface, the carefully maintained illusion of a world without mess or machinery. Critics have noted the implications of this philosophy. Disneyland was, in essence, a benevolent dictatorship, a space where one man's vision was imposed absolutely, where deviation was not tolerated, where the appearance of happiness was maintained whether or not genuine happiness existed beneath it. Walt would not have seen it that way. He believed he was giving people what they wanted: escape from the messiness of ordinary life, refuge from a world that was often ugly and disappointing. If that escape required strict rules and constant vigilance, so be it. The alternative was chaos, and chaos was what he had spent his entire life trying to overcome. In Disneyland, reality was what Walt said it was. And for millions of visitors, that carefully constructed reality was more appealing than the genuine article. The real Mary Poppins was not a nanny. She was Walt Disney's housekeeper. Thelma Howard came to work for the Disney family in the early 1950s. She was a black woman from a modest background, hired to cook and clean and help manage the household. She stayed for 30 years. Walt valued loyalty above almost all other virtues, and Thelma Howard was loyal. She cared for the Disney home with dedication and discretion. She became, in many ways, part of the family, present at holidays, trusted with private matters, a constant and reassuring presence in the lives of Walt and Lillian and their daughters. Walt showed his appreciation in an unusual way. Every Christmas and every birthday, he gave Thelma shares of Disney stock. It was not a large gift in any single instance, a few shares here, a few shares there. But Thelma never sold. She held on to every share Walt gave her, year after year, decade after decade. By the time of her death in 1994, those shares had multiplied and grown in value beyond anything she could have imagined. Through stock splits and dividends and the steady growth of the Disney company, Thelma Howard's modest gifts had become a fortune. Her estate was worth $9.5 million. Her family was astonished. They had known she worked for the Disneys, but they had no idea she had accumulated such wealth. The housekeeper had become a millionaire, thanks to the generosity of her employer and her own patient faith in the company he had built. The story reveals something important about Walt Disney. He could be harsh with those he perceived as disloyal, the strikers, the union organizers, the employees who questioned his authority. But to those who served him faithfully, he could be extraordinarily generous. Thelma Howard was not famous. She did not create animated characters or design theme park attractions. She simply did her job day after day with quiet competence, and Walt rewarded that service in a way that transformed her family's fortunes. It was paternalism, certainly. Walt decided who deserved reward and who deserved punishment based on his own judgments about loyalty and worth. But it was also genuine care, expressed in the language Walt understood best: investment in the future, faith in the enterprise, the patient accumulation of value over time. Thelma Howard's story is not well known. It does not fit neatly into narratives about Walt Disney as either saint or villain. But it is true, and it adds a dimension to his character that the more dramatic controversies sometimes obscure. Diane Disney Miller spent her life defending her father. That defense tells us as much as any criticism could. Walt's older daughter grew into a thoughtful, articulate woman who understood both her father's greatness and his limitations. After his death, she became the primary guardian of his legacy, pushing back against what she saw as unfair characterizations while acknowledging the complexities of his character. In interviews, Diane spoke about her childhood with affection and clear-eyed honesty. She loved her father. She admired his vision and his determination. She also recognized that he was not an easy man to live with. "He was brilliant," she said in one conversation, "but he was also distant. He loved us, but he didn't always know how to show it in simple ways. Everything had to be a production." Years later, Diane recalled a Christmas morning when she was 12. She had asked her father for a simple gift, a day at the beach, just the two of them. No cameras, no schedules, no business meetings. Just a father and daughter spending time together. Walt gave her an elaborate dollhouse instead. It was professionally constructed, worth thousands of dollars. Every detail was perfect. Every miniature piece of furniture was exquisite. It was a gift that most children would have treasured. But it was not what she had asked for. She never got her day at the beach. Sharon's relationship with her father was more fraught still. The secret of her adoption had created a barrier between them, a sense that she was somehow different, somehow less fully a Disney than her sister. She had grown up in the same house, received the same privileges, been treated by all outward appearances as an equal member of the family. But the lie was there, hidden beneath the surface of every interaction. When she learned the truth as a young adult, the revelation confirmed suspicions she had harbored for years. She had always sensed something, some distance or difference that she could not name. Now she understood what it was. She had been lied to by the people she trusted most. She forgave her parents eventually. She understood that they had acted out of what they believed was love, however misguided their secrecy had been. But the wound never fully healed. There was always a guardedness in Sharon's relationship with Walt, a distance that adoption and deception had created. Both daughters married, had children, built lives of their own. They carried their father's legacy forward in different ways. Diane through active stewardship of his memory, founding the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco to present his life honestly and completely. Sharon through quieter contributions to family and philanthropy. They were Disney women, shaped by a childhood that was extraordinary in its privileges and its pressures. Walt Disney spent his life making Walt's dreams financially possible. He rarely received the credit he deserved. The relationship between the Disney brothers was one of the most important and least understood dynamics in the company's history. Walt was the visionary, the creative force, the public face of the enterprise. Roy was the businessman, the financial manager, the practical mind that kept the dreams from collapsing under their own weight. They needed each other. Walt's ambitions would have bankrupted the company a dozen times over without Roy's careful stewardship. Roy's caution would have prevented the company from ever achieving greatness without Walt's willingness to take risks. Together, they built an empire. Apart, neither could have succeeded. But the partnership was not without tension. Walt chafed against Roy's fiscal conservatism, seeing it as a lack of faith in his vision. In one meeting during the Florida project planning, Roy pushed back against Walt's budget projections with characteristic bluntness. "The numbers don't work," Roy said flatly. "We can't afford what you're proposing." Walt stared at his brother for a long moment. "The numbers never work," he replied, "and we always find a way." Roy sighed, the sigh of a man who had been finding ways for 40 years, who had mortgaged houses and negotiated loans and stretched budgets to make his brother's impossible dreams come true. Did Roy resent living in his brother's shadow? He never said so publicly. He was a private man, less comfortable with attention than Walt, content to work behind the scenes while Walt took the bows. But there must have been moments when the imbalance stung, when he wondered what his own legacy would be, whether anyone would remember his contributions after he was gone. Lillian Disney outlived her husband by 31 years. She almost never spoke about him publicly. After Walt's death, Lillian retreated from the spotlight. She had never sought attention, had always been content to support her husband from the shadows. Now, with Walt gone, she saw no reason to change. She lived quietly, engaged in philanthropy, maintained relationships with family and close friends. She donated generously to causes she cared about, including a major gift to the construction of the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, a building that would bear her husband's name and bring music to a city he had loved. But she gave few interviews, made few public appearances, offered few insights into the man she had married and lived with for 41 years. When reporters asked about Walt, she deflected. When biographers requested interviews, she declined. Whatever memories she carried, she kept them to herself. Her silence has been interpreted in various ways. Perhaps it was loyalty, a refusal to contribute to the endless analysis and speculation that surrounded her husband's legacy. Perhaps it was exhaustion, the weariness of a woman who had spent decades managing a difficult man and simply wanted peace. Perhaps it was privacy, the preference of a person who had never been comfortable with public attention. She died in 1997 at the age of 98. She had been Walt Disney's wife for 41 years and his widow for 31 more. Whatever she knew about him, whatever private memories she carried, she took them with her. The Disney family was not the fairy tale that the company's films depicted. There was love, certainly, deep and genuine love that bound parents to children, brother to brother, husband to wife. But there was also distance, secrecy, tension, and the complicated dynamics that exist in every family, magnified by extraordinary wealth and constant public scrutiny. Walt Disney created stories about families finding happiness, about parents and children reconciling, about love conquering all obstacles. His own family story was messier, more ambiguous, more human. It did not resolve neatly. It did not end with everyone living happily ever after. But it was real, and in its reality, it was perhaps more meaningful than any fairy tale could be. Walt Disney's final dream was not a theme park. It was a city, one he would govern completely. By the early 1960s, Disneyland had proven that Walt's vision could succeed on a grand scale. Millions of visitors passed through the gates each year, experiencing the carefully crafted world he had built. The park generated enormous profits and had become a cultural landmark, recognized around the globe as a symbol of American ingenuity and imagination. But Walt was not satisfied. He never was. Satisfaction would have meant rest, and rest would have meant confronting the silence within himself, the silence where his mother's voice used to be, where the Marceline farmhouse still stood in memory, where all the old wounds waited. The problem with Disneyland, as he saw it, was everything that surrounded it. The moment visitors stepped outside the park's boundaries, they encountered the chaos of the real world. Cheap motels with garish neon signs, fast food restaurants, gas stations, traffic congestion, all the ugliness that American commercial development could produce. Walt had created a perfect environment inside the gates, but he could not prevent the imperfect world from pressing against its edges. For his next project, he would think bigger. He would not merely build a park. He would build an entire city, one where he could extend his vision to every aspect of human life. The Florida Project, as it was initially called, began with secret land acquisitions in the early 1960s. Walt used dummy corporations with innocuous names: the Latin American Development and Management Corporation, the Reedy Creek Ranch Corporation, the IFR Corporation, a play on Interstate 4, which ran through the area, to purchase property in Central Florida. The secrecy was essential. If landowners realized that Disney was the buyer, they would raise their prices dramatically. The strategy worked. By the time the purchases were complete, the company had acquired nearly 27,000 acres, an area twice the size of Manhattan. The scale was unprecedented. Disneyland occupied 160 acres. Walt Disney World, as the Florida Project would eventually be named, would occupy an area 170 times larger. There would be room for theme parks, hotels, golf courses, and recreational areas. There would be room for everything Walt could imagine. And what he imagined was Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Epcot was not conceived as a theme park. It was conceived as a functioning city where 20,000 people would live and work. The city would be built under a climate-controlled dome, protecting residents from Florida's oppressive heat and humidity. Transportation would be provided by monorails and people movers, eliminating the need for private automobiles in the city center. Every aspect of urban life would be designed for maximum efficiency and comfort. Corporations would participate in the experiment, showcasing their newest technologies in housing, transportation, communication, and daily life. The city would be a permanent World's Fair, a living laboratory where the future was constantly being invented and tested. Walt described his vision in a promotional film made shortly before his death. He stood before maps and models, his enthusiasm evident despite his failing health, explaining how Epcot would solve the problems that plagued American cities: the traffic, the pollution, the blight, the decay. Epcot will always be in a state of becoming, he said. It will never cease to be a living blueprint of the future, where people actually live a life they can't find anywhere else in the world. His eyes were bright with the vision. His voice was strong with conviction. Watching the film today, knowing what was about to happen, is almost unbearably poignant. The vision was extraordinary. It was also, in ways that Walt may not have fully recognized, deeply troubling. In Walt's perfect city, no one would own their home, no one would vote, and no one could stay forever. The details of Epcot governance structure revealed the extent of Walt's desire for control. The Disney company would own all property within the city. Residents would be tenants, not homeowners, subject to rules and regulations established by the company. There would be no elected government, no democratic participation in decision-making, no town council or mayor or public meetings where citizens could voice their concerns. The company would provide services, maintain order, and determine policy. If residents disagreed with a decision, they had no recourse except to leave. There were no property rights to protect, no voting rights to exercise, no constitutional guarantees that applied within the boundaries of a private development. Furthermore, residents would not be permitted to remain indefinitely. Epcot was conceived as a showcase for new technologies and new ways of living. If residents became too settled, too attached to the status quo, they might resist the constant innovation that Walt envisioned. Therefore, residency would be temporary. People would come, experience the future, and then move on, making room for others. Walt presented these arrangements as practical necessities. A city dedicated to experimentation could not be bound by conventional property rights or democratic processes. Change required flexibility, and flexibility required centralized authority. He was not building a dictatorship. He was building a laboratory. But critics have noted the troubling implications. In some ways, Epcot resembled a company town of the 19th century, those communities built around coal mines or steel mills, where the corporation owned every house, every store, every inch of land, and where workers lived at the pleasure of their employer. Workers in those towns had no rights except what the company chose to grant. They could be evicted for any reason, fired without recourse, controlled in every aspect of their lives. Walt would have rejected this comparison. He saw Epcot as liberation, not control. The residents would be free from crime, free from pollution, free from traffic and ugliness and all the problems that made American cities increasingly unlivable. They would exchange the false freedom of democracy, the freedom to vote for politicians who never solved anything, for the real freedom of a well-designed life. But the structures he designed would have granted the Disney company powers that no democratic government would accept. The freedom to speak, to organize, to protest, to own property, to vote, these are not luxuries. They are the foundations of liberty. A city without them, however clean and efficient, is not a utopia. It is a prison with comfortable furniture. Was this Walt's vision of the ideal society? A world where a wise authority, himself or his company, made all the important decisions, freeing ordinary people from the burden of choice. A world where the messiness of democracy was replaced by the efficiency of corporate management. The question cannot be answered definitively. Walt died before Epcot could be built, and the city that eventually bore the name was a theme park, not a residential community. We cannot know how he would have responded to the challenges of governing an actual population, how he would have balanced his desire for order against the legitimate needs of residents for autonomy and self-determination. What we can say is that the Epcot concept represented the logical endpoint of Walt's lifelong project. He had spent decades building controlled environments, first on film, then in theme parks. Epcot would have extended that impulse to its ultimate conclusion, a controlled environment where people actually lived, where every aspect of existence was designed and managed, where the chaos and disappointment of the real world could be permanently excluded. It was the final expression of a wounded child's dream, a world where fathers did not fail, where families did not fracture, where the things you loved could never be taken away. It was Marceline, perfected and preserved forever, expanded to the scale of a city. Whether it would have been paradise or prison, we will never know. The man who built kingdoms could not escape his own body. In the autumn of 1966, Walt Disney was 65 years old and still working at his usual relentless pace. He was overseeing the Florida project, developing new attractions for Disneyland, planning films and television programs, meeting with executives and artists and engineers. His energy seemed inexhaustible, his enthusiasm undimmed by age. But something was wrong. He had been experiencing pain in his neck and leg for months, symptoms he attributed to an old polo injury from decades earlier. When the pain persisted and worsened, he finally agreed to see a doctor. The X-rays revealed a spot on his left lung. Walt had been a heavy smoker for most of his adult life, consuming 3 or more packs of cigarettes daily for decades. He had tried to hide the habit from the public, understanding that it conflicted with his wholesome image. The kindly uncle who entertained children should not be seen with a cigarette dangling from his lips. But the damage had been done. The cancer that would kill him had been growing silently for years. On November 7, 1966, surgeons at St. Joseph Hospital in Burbank removed Walt's entire left lung. The operation revealed what the X-rays had not fully shown. The cancer had spread further than anyone had hoped. It had reached his lymph nodes. The prognosis was grim, perhaps 2 years, perhaps less. Walt responded to the diagnosis with characteristic determination. He refused to accept that his work was finished. From his hospital bed, he continued planning the Florida project, discussing details with executives, sketching ideas on whatever paper was available. According to legend, he would lie in his hospital bed and point at the ceiling tiles above him, using the grid as a map of his imagined city. He would describe where the monorails would run, where the residential areas would be located, where the industrial showcases would stand. His brother Roy, visiting the hospital, would listen and nod and take notes, trying to follow Walt's vision as it played out on the acoustic tiles overhead. The story may be apocryphal. It has the quality of a myth designed to illustrate Walt's devotion to his work, but it captures something true about his final days. Even facing death, he could not stop building. The compulsion that had driven him since childhood, to create, to design, to impose order on chaos, remained with him to the end. Roy visited his brother regularly during those final weeks, and the two men talked about the future. Walt made Roy promise to continue the Florida project, to see it through to completion, to build the city that Walt would not live to see. "Promise me, Roy," Walt said. "Don't let them stop. Don't let them change what we're trying to do." Roy promised. He had spent his life supporting his brother's visions. He would not stop now, even after Walt was gone. On the morning of December 15, 1966, Walt Disney's condition suddenly deteriorated. He had been improving, or seemed to be, talking with family, planning for the future, maintaining the optimism that had carried him through every previous crisis. Then his heart began to fail. At 9:35 in the morning, Walter Elias Disney took his last breath. Outside the hospital window, the California sun was rising over the hills, the same hills he had seen when he first arrived in Hollywood 43 years earlier, a young man with $40 and a cardboard suitcase and a reel of unfinished film. The dreamer was gone, the dreams remained. The news spread quickly around the world. Newspapers in every language carried the story on their front pages. Television broadcasts interrupted regular programming to announce the death. Tributes poured in from presidents and prime ministers, from fellow artists and ordinary fans. The man who had shaped the imaginations of millions was gone. But even in death, Walt Disney would not be allowed to rest quietly. A myth was about to be born, one that would prove as persistent as any of the fairy tales he had brought to life. The most enduring myth about Walt Disney is that he is frozen beneath Disneyland, waiting to return. It is completely false, but the lie reveals a deeper truth. Within months of Walt's death, rumors began circulating that his body had not been buried or cremated in the conventional manner. Instead, according to the whispers, Walt had arranged to be cryogenically preserved, his corpse frozen in liquid nitrogen to await a future when medical science could cure his cancer and restore him to life. The rumor had a specific origin. In January of 1967, just weeks after Walt's death, a man named James Bedford became the first human being to be cryogenically preserved. The timing was coincidental but suggestive. If cryonics was now possible, might Walt Disney have been an early adopter? Might the man who had always embraced new technology have chosen this ultimate technological gamble? The story spread through tabloids and word of mouth, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some versions claimed that Walt's frozen body was stored in a secret vault beneath Disneyland, kept at temperatures far below zero, waiting for the day when science would advance enough to bring him back. Others specified that only his head had been preserved, since the technology to freeze an entire body was not yet perfected. The details varied, but the core claim remained consistent. Walt Disney was not truly dead, he was waiting. The truth is far more mundane. Walt Disney was cremated on December 17, 1966, 2 days after his death. His ashes were interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, in a small private ceremony attended by immediate family members. There was no cryogenic preservation, no secret vault, no frozen head, no technological resurrection waiting in the future. Diane Disney Miller spent years debunking the myth, growing increasingly frustrated with its persistence. There is absolutely no truth to the rumor that my father, Walt Disney, wished to be frozen, she stated publicly. I doubt my father had ever heard of cryonics. But the myth persists. It appears in articles and documentaries, repeated as fact or presented as tantalizing possibility. It has become part of the Disney legend, as familiar as Mickey Mouse or Cinderella's Castle or the theme song to It's a Small World. Why does the story endure? Perhaps because it fits so perfectly with what we know, or think we know, about Walt Disney. Here was a man who spent his life trying to defeat time, to preserve the past, to create worlds where nothing beautiful ever died. Main Street USA is frozen in 1910 forever. Sleeping Beauty never ages. Peter Pan never grows up. Of course, such a man would want to defeat death itself. Of course, he would reach for immortality. The cryonics myth is false in its facts but true in its psychology. Walt Disney did seek immortality, not through frozen preservation, but through his creations. Every film, every character, every theme park attraction was an attempt to leave something permanent behind, to build structures that would outlast his mortal body, to achieve the only immortality available to human beings. Children who were not born when he died grow up watching his films. Families who never knew him visit his parks. His vision of wonder and imagination continues to shape how millions of people experience the world. That influence extends across generations, touching lives he never knew existed, shaping imaginations he never encountered. This is the real immortality, the immortality of influence, of creation, of work that continues to matter after the worker is gone. Walt Disney achieved it more fully than almost anyone in the 20th century. The frozen body is a myth. The living legacy is real. Walt Disney died in 1966. The Walt Disney Company almost died with him. The decades following Walt's death were difficult for the company he had built. Without his creative vision and relentless drive, the studio struggled to find direction. Executives asked themselves, what would Walt do? Before every decision, but no one could answer with certainty. The result was a kind of paralysis, a reluctance to take risks, a tendency to repeat past successes rather than seek new ones, a slow decline into mediocrity. Roy Disney fulfilled his promise to his brother. He took personal charge of the Florida project, overseeing every detail with the same determination Walt had shown. When other executives suggested cutting costs or scaling back the vision, Roy refused. This would be Walt's memorial, and it would be built as Walt had wanted. Walt Disney World opened on October 1, 1971. Roy insisted that it bear his brother's full name, not just Disney World but Walt Disney World, as a permanent tribute to the man whose vision had made it possible. At the dedication ceremony, Roy stood before the crowds and cameras, frail but resolute. Walt Disney World is a tribute to the philosophy and life of Walter Elias Disney, he said, and to the talents, the dedication, and the loyalty of the entire Disney organization that made Walt Disney's dream come true. 2 months later, Roy Disney was dead. He had held on just long enough to fulfill his final obligation to his brother. Then, as if his own purpose was complete, he let go. He was 78 years old. Without either Disney brother, the company drifted. The 1970s and early 1980s were a period of decline. The animation studio produced films that were competent but uninspired. The Aristocats, Robin Hood, The Fox and the Hound, none of them achieving the magic of Snow White or Pinocchio or Cinderella. The theme parks continued to draw visitors, but innovation slowed. Corporate raiders began circling, sensing weakness. In 1984, the company faced a serious takeover threat from financiers who wanted to break it up and sell the pieces. The Disney library of animated films alone was worth billions. The theme parks could be sold to hotel chains. The name itself could be licensed for merchandise. The Raiders saw an underperforming asset that could be stripped for parts. The company survived by bringing in new leadership. Michael Eisner became chief executive officer, and he brought new energy and new ambition to the enterprise. He revitalized the animation studio, greenlighting projects that had languished in development, hiring talented artists who had grown up loving Disney films and wanted to restore the company to greatness. The results were spectacular. The Little Mermaid, released in 1989, was the first Disney animated film in decades to achieve both critical acclaim and massive commercial success. Beauty and the Beast followed, becoming the first animated film ever nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. Aladdin and the Lion King continued the Renaissance, breaking box office records and producing hit songs that dominated the radio. The theme parks expanded. New attractions opened. New parks were built in France, in Japan, eventually in China. Disney acquired other companies. Pixar, the animation studio that had revolutionized the industry with computer-generated films like Toy Story. Marvel, with its universe of superhero characters. Lucasfilm, bringing Star Wars and Indiana Jones into the Disney family. And eventually 21st Century Fox, one of the largest media acquisitions in history. Today, the Walt Disney Company is worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It is one of the largest media companies in the world, producing films, television programs, and streaming content that reaches billions of people. The enterprise that Walt and Roy built in a garage has become a global colossus. What would Walt think of all this? The question is impossible to answer with certainty. He died before the internet, before streaming video, before the globalization of entertainment that has made Disney a presence in virtually every country on Earth. The company that bears his name has evolved in ways he could never have anticipated. Some things perhaps would please him. The continued success of animation, the expansion of the theme parks, the enduring popularity of characters he created, these would surely bring satisfaction. He always wanted to build something that would last, and it has lasted beyond anything he could have imagined. Other things might trouble him. The corporate acquisitions, the focus on intellectual property, the transformation of Disney from a creator of original content into a consolidator of existing franchises. These represent a different philosophy than the one Walt embodied. He was a maker, not a buyer. He wanted to create new things, not acquire old ones. But the dead do not get to judge the living. Walt Disney made his choices, built his legacy, and passed from the world. What came after was shaped by others, responding to circumstances he never faced, making decisions he never had to make. The company is his in name and origin, but it belongs now to the people who run it, the people who work for it, the audiences who consume its products. This is the fate of all legacies. They escape the control of their creators and take on lives of their own. Who was Walt Disney? After 65 years of life and decades of analysis since his death, we still cannot fully answer the question. He was a visionary who transformed entertainment, proving that animation could be art, that theme parks could be experiences, that a single creative imagination could reshape how millions of people spent their leisure time. He changed what was possible. He expanded what we could dream. He was a wounded child who built kingdoms against his pain, spending his life trying to recreate the paradise he had lost in Marceline, trying to construct worlds where the chaos and disappointment of his childhood could be permanently excluded. He ran from his past and built monuments to it simultaneously. He was a demanding boss who inspired extraordinary work from his employees, pushing them to achieve things they had not known they could achieve, creating an environment where excellence was expected and mediocrity was not tolerated. He made people better than they thought they could be. He was a man who named names before a congressional committee, contributing to a climate of persecution that damaged lives and violated principles of free association that Americans claim to hold dear. He had the capacity for vindictiveness. He was a family man who loved his wife and daughters but struggled to express that love in simple ways, who gave them elaborate gifts but not always his presence, who created a company celebrating family magic while finding family intimacy difficult. He was better at building dreams than building relationships. He was a product of his era who held some views that now seem backward or troubling, who made films that perpetuated stereotypes, who failed to see injustices that were visible to others. He was blind to some things that mattered. He was not a saint. He was not a monster. He was a human being, complicated and contradictory, capable of great generosity and great petness, of visionary creativity and vindictive score-settling. He contained multitudes as all human beings do, and those multitudes did not always coexist peacefully. The temptation is to resolve these contradictions, to declare him either hero or villain, to flatten his complexity into a simple narrative that fits on a bumper sticker. But simple narratives are lies, and Walt Disney deserves better than lies. He deserves to be remembered as he was, a man of extraordinary gifts and ordinary flaws, who changed the world in ways both wonderful and troubling, who left behind a legacy that continues to shape our culture decades after his death. The model room at WED Enterprises is empty now. The tiny buildings of Epcot stand silent, preserved in some Disney archive, a monument to a city that was never built as Walt imagined it. The miniature monorails will never carry passengers. The climate-controlled dome will never shelter residents from the Florida heat. The perfect community exists only in plaster and imagination, and in the film Walt made before he died. What eventually opened under the Epcot name was not a city. It was a theme park, a wonderful theme park, innovative in its own way, with pavilions celebrating human achievement and cultures from around the world. But it was not what Walt had envisioned. It was not a place where people lived. It was a place where people visited and then went home. Perhaps that was for the best. Perhaps a city governed by a corporation, where residents had no vote and no property rights, would have been a dystopia rather than a utopia. Perhaps the Epcot that exists is better than the Epcot that Walt imagined. Or perhaps we lost something when we lost that vision, some willingness to dream big, to imagine fundamentally different ways of living, to believe that the future could be designed rather than merely endured. Perhaps our cynicism about utopias has made us unable to build anything better than what we have. These questions have no easy answers. They are the questions that Walt Disney's life and work continue to pose decades after his death. Walt Disney is gone. He died on a December morning in 1966, and his ashes rest in a garden at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. There is no frozen body, no secret vault, no technological resurrection waiting in the future. He is as dead as every human being who has ever lived, subject to the same mortality that claims us all. But something remains. In Marceline, Missouri, the farm where Walt spent the happiest years of his childhood is now a museum and tourist attraction. The barn where he drew his first pictures still stands. The fields where he played still stretch toward the horizon. People come from around the world to walk the paths where a young boy once ran free, to see the place that shaped the man who shaped their childhoods. The trains still pass through Marceline. They always will. The railroad that once carried young Walt away from his paradise still runs, its whistles echoing across the prairie as they did more than a century ago. The sound is the same. The boy who heard it is gone. Walt Disney spent his entire life trying to stop time, to preserve perfection, to build worlds where nothing beautiful ever died. He failed, of course. Time stopped him instead, as it stops everyone. The kingdoms he built endure, but the king is gone. And yet, in every child who believes in magic, something of Walt Disney survives. In every family that gathers to watch an animated film, something of his vision persists. In every moment of innocent wonder that survives in a cynical world, his influence can be felt. He wanted to give people happiness. He wanted to create experiences that would lift them out of their ordinary lives and transport them to places where dreams came true. He succeeded, imperfectly and incompletely, as all human endeavors are imperfect and incomplete. But he succeeded. The man is dead, the dream lives on. Perhaps that was the real Epcot all along. Not a city under a dome, not a controlled environment where every variable was managed, but something simpler and more profound. The idea that joy can be constructed, that wonder can be designed, that even the children of broken homes can build kingdoms. Walt Disney was born on December 5, 1901 in Chicago, Illinois. He died on December 15, 1966 in Burbank, California. He lived 65 years. In between those dates, he created a mouse and a duck and a theme park, and a company that would outlast him by generations. He made millions of people happy. He made some people miserable. He changed the world in ways that are still being measured and debated and understood. He was Walt Disney. There will never be another like him. And whatever else we say about him, whatever criticisms we make, whatever flaws we acknowledge, whatever complications we recognize, we must also say this: he made the world more magical. He gave us permission to dream. He showed us that imagination, properly applied, can change reality itself. That is not a small legacy. That is not a simple legacy, but it is a real one, and it is ours. That was his story. Thank you for spending this time with his memory.